You are now in Moscow at our headquarters studio. I'm Dmitry Medvedenko, and this is the three-way weekly debate show that we are bringing to you live between Moscow, London, and Washington. Now, today's topic is Desperados as revolutionaries. Who are the new poor, and how do they affect the Arab Spring and Europe's winter? We are talking, of course, about Egypt, where still thousands of impoverished people are lingering through the streets, and Greece right now, as you may know, thousands of people also gathering there to protest against fresh austerity measures. Now, this is all, as most experts agree, due to economic imbalances in these countries. The problem is that new financial and economic crises become ever deeper and more frequent, and they affect larger and larger numbers of countries. Now, let me introduce our guests right now. With me here in the studio is my co-host, that's Dmitry Babic, Radio VR's own political analyst and commentator.
Nice to see you on the video.
Yes, thank you very much for being with us here. And Mr. Boris Kagarlitsky, he is the head of the Institute of Globalization Studies in Moscow. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Hello.
Also in London, we will be having, actually we do have at the moment right now, Matthew Jameson. He's a consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute.
Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you, Matthew. And I believe via Skype we are going to have, or we already have, Mr. Benjamin Barber. He's a senior research scholar at the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Mr. Barber, if you can hear me, please say so.
Good day. How are you?
Oh, great. We have Mr. Benjamin Barber. Now, before we go to any one of you gentlemen, and I remind you that your mics are on all the time and you're free to join the discussion anytime you want. Let me just go ahead with a comment, to play back a comment from Jeffrey Sommers. He's a professor of political economy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Let's take a listen to this fragment we've prepared for you.
The spark for these revolutions, I think, was the increase in grain prices. So you have people who are very poor, and we know that over the past 5 years, grain prices have increased significantly. This is an outcome of two things. One, the United States diverting much of its agricultural land to production for biofuels. And so a lot of land that was growing food is now growing fuel for your fuel tank, your gas tank in your truck or your car. And so that means that there's less food, and that means, given the laws of supply and demand, there's going to be an increase in price. In effect, the revolutions in Egypt, I don't want to make this overly simplistic or deterministic, but many of these revolutions, in effect, are an outcome of the 2008 crisis because of the impact that it had on grain prices.
All right, so that was Mr. Jeff Sommers. He is the professor of political economy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I will ask my first question to our Moscow guest, who's with us here, Boris Kagarlitsky. Just a reminder, he's the head of Institute of Globalization Studies in Moscow. Boris, do you agree basically with the fundamental statement that these crises, notably first in Egypt, we'll talk about Egypt first, is economy-driven?
Well, of course, and actually with Jeff we work together on the same project which we call Post-Globalization Initiative, which is exactly trying to put together all these facts and tendencies to work on the perspective of some kind of new, I shouldn't say new world order maybe, but some kind of new approaches, new policies which can help us to kind of overcome the current crisis in terms of understanding that what we're going to have in a couple of years already, a couple of years from now, is we're going to have ruins. See, it's not some kind of brilliant, nice dream of another world is possible and so on. There'll be ruins, and we'll have to rebuild societies on these ruins. We have to understand this reality.
Now, how inevitable is that?
I think it's already happening. It's already happening because the global system, the global economic system, the new liberal world order as it was built throughout the 90s is technically falling apart. And the anti-crisis policies of the global elites are actually making things worse. They're reproducing the crisis, they're kind of stabilizing the situation, but instead of stabilizing the societies, they're stabilizing the crisis itself. They're making these contradictions and problems which led to the crisis reproduce and develop, and in that sense they make things dramatically worse.
All right, well, let's ask Mr. Benjamin Barber, who's with us on Skype. Do you agree that we are going to have ruins everywhere, Mr. Benjamin Barber?
Well, that's a little melodramatic, but we already have devastation in many parts of the world. I think the key term here is interdependence. That is to say, the interdependence of politics and economics. It's not just economics, but certainly there's a radical intersection between economics and politics. In Egypt, for example, 20 million young, educated Egyptians were out of work under Mubarak. They were out of work under Morsi, and they're still out of work under the new regime being installed as we speak, and that will impact any attempted political solution. But there's also the interdependence of the Egyptian economy and the economies of the Arab world and the global economy, which is still dominated by the financial crisis, by austerity policies imposed by banks in countries which have been ruinous to local economy and to the welfare state, and the interdependence both of the global economy with what's happening in Egypt and Libya and Syria, and also the interdependence internally of the economic crisis, which is reflecting the global crisis, and then the ongoing political crisis, the search for new forms of regime in countries that have had very little experience with any kind of democracy, sets up a situation that is certainly extremely difficult for the people inside those countries to deal with.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Benjamin Barber. Let's throw for a second to Mr. Matthew Jameson from London. Now, Matthew, you are obviously an expert in everything that's going on in Egypt, as far as I've heard, at least. Well, do you agree basically with this initial statement that we've just made, just to make sure we're on the same page? Is the economic situation in Egypt, as we know, which has been dire for quite a while, especially after the 2008 crisis, is this the main driver of all the political friction, or is it something specific in Egypt that we have there?
No, I would agree. I think that the economics of the situation is very much the main driver. You have a terrible situation in Egypt where a huge amount of the population, something like 60 million, I believe, are living on something like less than $1 a day. And as the other chap pointed out about the huge amount of young unemployed people, and these are educated people and they have degrees and so on, and there's an immense amount of frustration. So the high unemployment, the poor living standards, but also there is an intersection between the economics and then the lack of a responsive, inclusive, accountable and democratic government that listens to the people, that works on these matters, and if they're not progressing, then they can be chucked out at the next election. And they didn't have that. And so, of course, without those basic fundamental human rights of human dignity, of freedom of expression and freedom of voting and freedom of assembly and so on and so forth, and then the terrible economic situation, it's no wonder that this terrible catastrophe has arisen in Egypt.
All right, well, Mr. Dmitry Babich, do you have anything to comment on what we've heard so far?
Well, maybe I'll just develop on it and ask a question to Boris or to Benjamin if they want to answer. We see that actually the Western perception of the revolutions, which were supposed to come, if you remember, in 2003, George Bush talked about this greater Middle East strategy. He expected democratic revolutions to have a domino effect. And Bush and others obviously expected these revolutions to be led by a middle class, which is going to be distraught with dictatorship. And the revolutions were supposed to be nice. Okay, maybe a few people would get beaten or killed, but no one expected civil wars. And what we see is what Jameson has just described. We see the impoverished middle class. We see the students in Egypt who graduated with excellent grades, with degrees in archaeology or biology, and they find themselves out of work. They find themselves as new desperados. The theme of our program, Desperados, is the new revolutionaries. So I don't know if maybe Boris or Benjamin would like to comment on this. Boris, I know that you're a specialist on the impoverishment of the middle class. And Benjamin, I remember that in one of your articles you wrote about true liberals who are somehow different, obviously, from the narrow liberals which we are seeing now in power in many countries.
Well, it was already in the early 2000s when I wrote a book, The Revolt of the Middle Class, which was written in Russian, of course, and published in Russia, but also published in English, and then in Spanish, and then actually in Arabic. And in Arabic, it was published just during the first days of Egyptian revolution. So that made me kind of happy as an author, though, of course, the problems which were described in the book were not kind of making me happy, because that was exactly a kind of re-examination of this traditional thesis of the middle class being kind of the basis of stability, being the driving force of some kind of pro-market politics and so on and so on. And I was showing that, yes, at some point, really in the West, the new middle class, which emerged after the welfare state, because of the welfare state, it started getting kind of bored by the way welfare state. It was getting kind of tired of the welfare state, of its redistribution, bureaucracy, and so on. So it shifted to the right. It shifted to neoliberalism. It shifted to Thatcherite politics in Britain and in the United States. But these very policies, they actually started strangling the middle class, squeezing it and destroying it. Actually, in fact, Paul Krugman wrote a very similar thing in his own work. So I think this is the dialectics of this kind of change, so that the new liberal policies initially were brought forward by some support of the middle classes, but they radicalized the middle classes, and now the middle class are strongly against these policies, are becoming a real revolting mass.
All right, so this brings us to some of the structural problems that we have in Egypt's economy. We're talking about the middle class being impoverished, pushed down into basically poverty. As Matthew Jameson has said, we have 60 million people in Egypt living under $1 a day. Now, Matthew, correct me if I'm wrong in quoting you with this, but I think that's what you said.
No, I think that's correct, yeah.
All right,
so absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Is there such a thing, has there been such a thing as the middle class in Egypt? Because Egypt, before the crisis of 2008, we saw economic growth of 5-6%, and also coupled with a demographic situation when the population was growing very quickly. And of course, this has led to massive unemployment that we're seeing at present day too. Now, is there such a thing as the middle class in Egypt today?
Well, can I jump in on that?
Of course, Benjamin. Yeah.
You'd asked me earlier too, because the problem is, if you define the middle class by their professional status and education, Egypt and other parts of the Middle Eastern world have a growing and extensive middle class. But if you define the middle class by full participation in the economy and a decent income and pensions and so on, then obviously there is no middle class, because many of those educated young men and women, though they have a career foundation, have no jobs and have no prospect for jobs. And in that disparity is a lot of the problem. The other problem we face, and this is answering your early question, we have become so impatient, understandably, in a world of instant media, with the progress of growing a democracy, that if it doesn't happen in 6 hours or 6 days or perhaps 6 weeks, we all feel it's failed. The Russian Revolution first took place in 1904, then 1917, and perhaps only in 1989 did it really begin to move towards a genuine democracy. The French Revolution happened in 1789. It was at least 150 years before the French got real democracy. In the United States, we had a revolution in 1776, but a slave-based republic until our Civil War. These things take time, yet we look on and urge people to do this overnight, to transform themselves, and it's particularly hard to do, and that's the subject of your concerns. It's very hard to transform a traditional patriarchal monarchy or dictatorship or military regime into a democracy in the absence of genuine economic opportunity, economic middle class, and economic jobs. And so that slows down the process still further. And it's very clear to me that Egypt and Libya and other countries are unlikely to move towards genuine democracy until they do provide a foundation for middle-class citizenship, which has to include full economic opportunity.
All right. Well, Benjamin, thank you very much for that comment. Now, I'm gonna ask everyone for a pause for a second. Now, you brought up a very interesting topic, and that is the speed of the processes which are happening right now. Now, in the beginning, from the early 2000s, mainstream Western media expected prosperity in the new united Europe and pleasant democratic revolutions that you've been talking about in the Middle East, North Africa, and possibly even in Russia. Now, what happened was a terrible economic slump in the European Union, bloody and violent civil wars in Libya and Syria, and impoverishment in Egypt, and well, nothing really happening in Russia in that respect. Some of us could say, as Dmitry has been pointing out, thank God. Now, let's listen to another fragment from Jeffrey Sommers, then we'll take it from there.
After the 2008 crisis, since governments did not want to use fiscal measures, in other words, government deficit spending, in order to address the crisis, they had to resort to the only tool that they had left, which is a really lousy one, but it's better than doing nothing, which is quantitative easing, which is just throwing lots of money at the banks. Well, in the hopes that they would then move that money into the real economy. Well, as we know, that money was largely used for speculative purposes, and it caused asset inflation. It drove up the prices of oil and grain.
All right, well, from here, let's talk to Matthew Jameson in London. Matthew, now, because of this factor of speed, yeah, someone's phone is ringing, please turn that off. Because of this factor of speed, what we've seen in Egypt, we've seen Mubarak being overthrown in 2011, then we had fair elections, and then for just 1 year, President Morsi was in power. So 1 year he was in power to do anything about these structural problems in the economy. Obviously, he failed because these are structural problems, not short-term, basically, spikes of a crisis. Now, why do you think the Egyptian people have been so impatient to get rid of him too?
Well, I think that the Egyptian people got fed up with him because he wasn't actually addressing their problems. And he wasn't really tackling what they are primarily concerned about. Most Egyptians want a good job. They want financial and economic stability and security for themselves and their families. They want a reasonable standard of living. They want to be able to take care of themselves and to feed their children and to clothe them and educate them, etc., like we in the West. They just want these basic fundamental human rights and economic justice. And I think that President Morsi and his colleagues started to embark on another agenda which most Egyptians didn't really want and hadn't actually really voted for. And of course that was a sort of a greater Islamization, religious agenda, which made people feel very queasy. And he was seen to not be addressing these problems. Now, of course, these problems are going to take a very, very long time to address. And it will probably take more than one presidency. It will be decades, and it's more than just one man. But I feel as though the Egyptian people felt that really the Muslim Brotherhood were not paying enough attention and really engaging with these vital problems.
Well, if I could just jump in here for a second.
Of course.
You know, my question is to Boris and probably to Benjamin. Well, Mr. Morsi, actually, could he provide anything? I mean, he didn't do anything enormously stupid in terms of modern neoliberal economic worldview. He brought in, you know, that Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, who is seen as sort of a person suggesting right-wing solutions to poor people's problems, you know. But in the modern world, which is basically based on usury, you know, let's call a spade a spade, the model banking system where you can make money mostly on usury. I understand why people opt for Islamism, because Islam actually prohibits usury. But the question is, can you survive and can you create a viable economy in a single country inside the world based on usury. This is an old question that Mr. Stalin could try to answer. Can you build socialism in one separate country? So can you build a viable economy without usury in a world based on usury?
All right, great question. We'll start with Boris and then we'll move to Benjamin with the same question.
I think I will answer like Barack Obama, yes, we can. Though the irony is that, of course, if you just do it in one single country, you will either get defeated or you'll make all other countries to follow you. Mm-hmm. In that sense, one country can start something and then others will be forced to do it. By the way, Egypt is a very strong country in Arab terms, in terms of Arab world. So in that sense, they can lead the whole region. They just didn't do it. And that was the big problem because Morsi actually continued exactly the same policies as his predecessor. So that's why he was so much punished. And again, you see, very often we say no short-term solutions are possible, you have to wait and so on. I disagree completely because, first of all, short-term solutions are possible, and this is exactly why revolutions are becoming necessary. Revolutions are exactly to make long-term problems solved in short-term by very radical and very drastic and sometimes not very nice measures, like confiscating property of the 10% of the most wealthy citizens and so on. And second, you see, Egyptians are no less impatient than French were, say, in 1789 or in 1968, by the way. So in that sense, it's nothing to do with internet. It's about revolution. Revolutions, they are exactly about making people impatient, and that's why revolutions are necessary, because otherwise things simply don't happen. Because they were patient for hundreds of years sometimes, or for dozens of years, nothing happened. Mm-hmm. Then at some point they become impatient.
All right, Benjamin, what do you think about that?
Wow, well, we're getting quite an interesting discussion here. Quoting Stalin, quoting the need for radical revolution and violence. This is great. Really, perhaps we're going back 100 years in our discussion, but we have to look at what actually has happened in recent years. Nobody can argue against revolution because revolutions are historically inevitable. They do arise out of forces that create them. But we can suggest that revolutions do not in themselves begin to solve the problems. Revolutions decapitate dictatorships. They do not create democracy. They take away property from one elite, but indeed, in many cases, they simply transfer the property to new elites. If you want genuine equality, a violent revolution and overthrow of a regime will not do that. And here's why I come back to your question, and I disagree with the former speaker, and I agree with you. We live in an interdependent world. There is no country that in a planet of growing inequality among nations, within nations, and between nations can really do very much to solve its own economic problems by itself. And in the absence of genuine equality, genuine economic opportunity in Egypt or in Libya, it's going to be very difficult for any regime to do very well. We want to remember that Morsi got a majority of the vote, and even to this day, we can't talk about the Egyptian people against Morsi because roughly half of them still support Morsi. But the fact is neither Mubarak nor Morsi nor the new so-called liberal regime are likely to solve very many Egyptian problems in the context of a global inequality, the global domination of banks, the global domination of profits as the primary motive for international relations. It just isn't going to happen. So the real point is, in order to address the issue in Egypt, as you said, we also have to address the issues in the world economy.
All right, well, let me throw to Matthew with that. Now, Matthew, as we've seen, nothing much has happened over the past 2 years in terms of the Egypt economy coming back. Now, the only positive signs were actually on the Egyptian stock exchange as soon as Morsi was being overthrown. Now, we've seen a growth of 12.5%. Now, do you think this means that basically international investors are seeing Egypt the way it is right now under army control as a more safer bet in terms of economy? And let me couple with that with another question now. In 2 years after we've had new elections and another president has been will have been in power for another year, will anything change, or will we see yet another revolution?
Well, it's going to be a very tough, hard slog, and I wouldn't want to put any bets on it. I think all bets are off at the moment. But coming back to what the previous speaker said, I agree. It can't just be isolated in Egypt. This has got to be a whole global effort, and we have got to rebalance our economic policies away from the free market fundamentalism and neoliberalism that, we in this country, in Britain, have experienced since the late 70s right up until present day, or say in the United States, which started under President Reagan and has largely continued up until this day. We have got to return to a much more balanced economic policy, which includes a mixed economy and a fair distribution of wealth, because at the moment we have the 1%, in particular in the United States, and it. America is and has been throughout its history one of the greatest nations in the world for freedom and democracy and opportunity and social mobility. So who would have ever have thought in 2013 now the economic situation in the United States, as indeed in Great Britain to a certain extent, resembles a banana republic, where you have a tiny group of people, a tiny elite, that control a vast majority of the country's wealth. And meanwhile, middle-class people are not seeing growth in their wages and their incomes, and they haven't been for many decades now. And those at the bottom are doing even worse. Meanwhile, I believe in the United States, from 1980 onwards, something like the top 1 to 2% of tax earners had their incomes increased by over 200% up until 2007 after tax. Meanwhile, median wage earners only saw an increase of something like in the 40s or 50s. So this has got to be a whole effort in Europe, in America, and around the world to move to a more sensible, social democratic, balanced economy. And to have a more progressive taxation system and a more progressive wealth and welfare distribution system, and stringent regulation of those forces and entities that got us into this mess in the first place. And by that I mean the investment banks and the hedge funds, the speculators, who really have had a very, very good crisis, you look at it.
Matthew, thank you very much for that comment. That's actually very interesting if we're talking about this global effort in solving problems. Now, there are two issues here. First, the IMF did nothing in terms of the European crisis. In terms of the Egyptian crisis, Egypt never addressed the IMF for help. And then on the other hand, we have the Eurozone, which is using a combined effort in solving its own problems and not doing a very good job. Let's listen to Jacques Sapir. He's a French economist, head of research center at High School of Social Studies in France on that matter.
L'euro, si vous voulez, fonctionne au bord du gouffre.
The euro has been operating on the brink of a principle for 3 years since 2010. The crisis of the joint European currency became apparent in 2010 with the start of the Greek crisis. Since then, the euro has had a crisis every single year, and always there were temporary treatments applied. These treatments provided only short-term relief. In fact, they led to a situation where every new crisis is more devastating than the previous one.
Well, that's me, Dmitry Pavlich. I had a chance to listen to that full interview on our radio station, Voice of Russia, and it was interesting that Mr. Sapir later said that Germany, the country which is viewed as the ultimate beneficiary of euro, actually there are only the top 10% of the population that benefited from the introduction of euro. The other 90% of Germans have seen their real incomes stagnate during the last 10 years. And now we see them basically, we see their incomes getting lower because they have to bail out all of these other countries that suffered from the euro crisis.
Now let's take a look at the other end of that problem, and that's Greece.
Yeah. And so my question is to Boris or Benjamin or Jameson. What do you think is going to happen with Europe? We are going to see, is it true, as Mr. Sapir says, that we're going to see more frequent and deeper crises with every new year?
Well, it depends, because we don't know how long it can continue without breaking. So far, it's the question of resources. As long as they have enough resources to keep crisis going, they're kind of fueling the crisis. In that sense, they're making things worse, but they're making things worse by continuing along the lines of more of the same. And that means that, of course, things will get worse. And they will not get better. It's not in the sense that they will get worse to get better. They will just get worse, period. But
Not a
I'm getting
U-shaped
a
crisis,
bit mixed
but
up
an
with
L
all the...
crisis.
sorry?
Yeah, sorry, who was that?
That was me saying that it's not going to be a U-shaped crisis,
All
it's
right.
going to be an L-shaped crisis,
Right.
right?
No, but it's only if they have resources to sustain the crisis, to prevent the collapse. Ironically, the problem is exactly that once the collapse actually happens, that'll be the moment of change after which things can improve. So without a collapse so far, given the political balance of forces and given the elites which are absolutely determined not to change anything and to continue the way they go forever, collapse is not only inevitable but absolutely necessary, because it will change the balance of forces politically and will enable societies, economies, and people to develop in a different way. But the problem is the price of the matter, and it can be quite hard and quite horrifying in a way, because I can't exclude the breakdown of eurozone, and again, I'm not sure it's going to be a nice thing to happen. But
It feels like you want this to happen if you're expecting a collapse for progress.
Exactly, that's the point. That's exactly the contradiction of crisis or revolution or whatever. There is nothing actually good about revolutions, by the way. It's a very wasteful way of solving problems. The only thing we have to accept is that as long as the elites are determined to prevent change or substantial change, they talk change, but they never do anything. They do everything to prevent it happening. The only way you can get there is through some kind of crisis which involves collapses and revolutions.
All right, Benjamin, do you think the economy in Europe
Yes.
needs to bleed in order to get better?
No, I do not. And I think we want to remember that it's a two-way street between politics and economics. We've been talking appropriately about the impact of economic inequality, the domination of the banks, the domination of those who control 90% of the global economy over everybody else. But the reality is, in Europe and the United States and elsewhere in the world, we still do live in a democracy where people can vote as they choose, if they choose to vote that way. And the real response to the crisis in Europe is voting patterns all over Europe, including in Germany and Greece and Spain and Italy, that reject the sovereignty of the banks over the economy, that reject the sovereignty of profits over the welfare state and the right of people to enjoy a decent retirement and pensions and so forth. And that we can do. I mean, the fact is, the way you control the global economy and control inequality is through the ballot box when you are resisting the impact of money over the ballot box. Earlier, someone, I think our friend in London, talked about the U.S. as a banana republic. Well, that's silly. That's a cartoon. But the truth is, we are a middle-class petro-republic. We are dominated by the energy corporations. We are dominated by money lobbies. We've had Supreme Court decisions that allows big money to play a free role in elections. And that, of course, is a disaster for real democracy. But the response to global inequality, the response to the monopoly banks and monopoly corporations that try to dominate politics is greater democracy, better voting, people voting in ways that restore the autonomy of democracy and politics from economics. As long as economics dominates and monopolizes politics, then the inequalities and monopolies of economics will be retranslated into the political regime. When politics and democracy dominate economics and corporations and banks, then you restore the balance you're talking about. So in a word, Jefferson used to say the remedy for the failures of democracy is more democracy. And what we need in Europe, what we need in Egypt is actually more democracy, which is why throwing Morsi out by force was not a good solution to his ineptitude and the inability of the Brotherhood to make progress.
Anybody wanting to comment on this?
Well, in fact,
Boris, yes.
I'm a bit worried about my Western colleagues because, they fetishize the ballot box. And they keep thinking that they still live in the institutions of Western democracy of 1960s or 1970s. They don't. Institutions were a long time ago hijacked, corrupted, and in many ways paralyzed. So in that sense, the ballot box doesn't work the way it used to work like 20 years ago. And that's exactly why we have all these people in the streets. That's exactly why we have these indignados in Spain or all these strikes in Greece, because people vote and they know that the vote doesn't change anything. Like they vote in Italy and they end up with a government which is imposed on them by the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And they know that there is a kind of coalition of all parties or all big parties to carry on the same policy. So the question is how to make them kind of abandon that coalition. And at some point, democracy must play a role. At some point, it will use the ballot box. But I'm not sure that you can fetishize the ballot box and think that it will bring about the necessary change.
And
saying that we have to reestablish the integrity of democracy is not to fetishize democracy. The question is, what's the alternative? The alternative is somebody dictating, whether it's the Brotherhood or whether it's some so-called benevolent dictator telling us what to do. The only adequate response we have is the ballot box properly made autonomous and independent from big money.
Well, it will not become independent from big money just like because you want it. You see, the case of Argentina is very typical. They just threw away the elected president. They just threw away the elected parliament. They just beaten the deputies who were legally and properly elected. And
in 2003, you mean?
Yeah, Argentine during the Peso crisis. Mm-hmm. And they forced the institutions collapse and then created the new institutions from below in a semi-violent way, I should say. But it was just a popular uprising.
All right, well, let's get Matthew Jameson from London back into this conversation. We haven't heard from him for a long while. Matthew, how do you address the ballot box in Egypt now?
The ballot box in Egypt will have to go forward, and they will have to stick to a democratic path, because at the end of the day, as the American speaker said, there really is no alternative to democracy. But we have to make democracy work. And I think it's rather exciting, actually, in Egypt, in the sense that they are in the process now of building a new world. They're in the birth pangs of the birth of a brave new world, and in creating a new democracy. And the older democracies here in the West, we have become to a certain extent corrupted. The American speaker was talking about the role of big money in politics and in democracy. And of course, in America, that's a huge issue. The last presidential election, what was it, something like $6 billion was spent in total. To run for president now in America, you need to be able to raise at least about $1 or $2 billion. And you have to raise a huge amount to run for Congress. You have these super PACs, which can now raise unlimited amounts of money. There's no regulation about how much can be donated to them. There was one chap, Sheldon Adelson, who spent a huge amount of his personal fortune on backing candidates. And then, of course, you have all the other outside groups like the NRA, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. And you can see why you don't get anything done in gun control. So I think in Egypt, they have an opportunity to actually create a really true, viable democracy. We could actually learn something from that in the process.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Matthew Jameson, for that. I think with that, we will running out of time, and we're forced to actually round things up. Thank you, everyone, for being with us on this program with me, Dmitry Medvedenko, my co-host, political analyst Dmitry Babich, and with us in Moscow was Boris Kagarlitsky, head of Institute of Globalization Studies in Moscow. Thank you very much indeed. And Mr. Matthew Jameson, consultant fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, joined us from London, and Benjamin Barber, senior research scholar at the Centre of Philanthropy and Civil Society, joined us via Skype. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
We're going back to our news broadcast, I believe.